Welcome, everyone. My name is Tasha Bunch, and I'm the Program Director here at the Institute for Intellectual Property and Social Justice. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's webinar, which is the second webinar in this school year's IP for the People Academy series. This series is a free, digital, open access academy designed for and marketed to creators, inventors, and entrepreneurs from communities of color who have historically and continually been locked out of receiving key knowledge and resources related to protecting and profiting from their ideas. In this series, we aim to offer easy to digest and engaging talks on IP rights and navigating the IP system and building a business around your IP, highlighting tips and resources via live webinars like the one you're watching tonight, which are also saved as an on-demand video series on our YouTube page. Tonight's webinar is the first in a four-part series co-hosted with law firm Allen and Overy. Thank you all so much. Directed to providing information for entrepreneurs as you start up your business. Tonight's session focuses on initial startup information for forming your business organization. The other three webinars in this series will discuss different types of business contracts or agreements, how to raise capital to run the business, and how to develop and protect your intellectual property on a budget. We're glad you're here for tonight's session and hope you will join us for future sessions. During tonight's session, there will be a Q&A period. Please go ahead and put your questions in the chat whenever you think of them, and our moderator for tonight will ask your questions of the panelists when they have an opportunity to do so. And with that, now I'll turn it over to the program moderator, Quinn Hendricks.
Thank you so much, Tasha. Good evening, everyone. As my co-moderator mentioned, my name is Quinn Hendricks, and I'm a 3L at the University of Miami School of Law. I'm very excited to be facilitating today's discussion, and it is my pleasure to introduce a distinguished cast of panelists that we have joining us today. As mentioned, we'll leave room at the end of this discussion for questions, but again, please feel free to drop your questions in chat. Before we get underway, it'd be good to start with some introductions. Jennifer, we'll start with you, followed by David, and then Keith.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Cheng, and I am currently CEO and co-founder of PTM Therapeutics. We are a startup biotech company here in the San Francisco Bay Area, developing drugs for chronic diseases such as inflammatory bowel disease and cancer. I have been a part of the biotech industry for over 20 years, most of which is practicing IP lawyer, doing patent prosecution and patent strategy, and also general counsel. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar today.
Hi, good evening. I'm David Flechner. I'm a partner at the law firm Allen and Overy. I'm based in New York and in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and my practice focuses on general finance and capital markets work, so debt and equity issuances by companies that are looking to raise capital. I do quite a bit of work with international companies as well as U.S. companies in the fintech space. I do some work with startups, but most of my practice is around mature companies. My activities at the firm beyond my capital markets practice include mentorship through our LGBTQ plus affinity group, and I'm a co-chair of our pro bono activities out of our New York office. It's great to see you all. Look forward to questions, and thanks for being here.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Spence. I'm a partner at a boutique firm called Johnson & Oshan, or J&O Law. I've been in a number of firms before J&O, Latham and most before, so I can speak to being in a number of different firms. But my practice mainly focuses on early stage private companies. So that means focusing on formation, corporate governance, venture capital, M&A, all the way to exit, basically to right before IPO when someone like David would take over. Yeah, I mean, I was at Brown undergrad and BU Law. I'm happy to be here and always happy to answer questions and connect.
Thank you so much for the introductions. So you have an idea for a company, and what do you do next? What are some of the things that you need to think about? So today we're going to talk through these issues, mostly related to formation, jurisdiction, capitalization, and governance. And we'll also learn from our panelists about their experiences along the way. Jennifer, we'll start with you to get us rolling. So what are the types of entities? Jennifer, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
You think after 3 years I would learn how to unmute myself? Great. So the entity types that we're going to focus on today are sole proprietorships, LLCs, or limited liability companies, and the corporation. So these are not the only entity types that you can choose from, but these are probably, they cover the most popular or the most selected ones. So those are the ones that we're really going to focus on today. And just so to touch upon this, you're getting to form your company, you're faced with the decision of what entity type am I going to choose? Am I going to be a sole proprietorship? Am I going to be an LLC? Am I going to be a corporation? There are different requirements for all three of them, but really you should look at your particular situation and what your company goals are and what you want for the company, and you want to choose the right one for you, because getting down the road, if you want to switch between these, it's kind of a headache, and you want to be able to avoid that if at all possible. So selecting the right one from the very beginning just helps with the ease of running your entity down the road.
Could you maybe touch on what a sole proprietorship is?
Sure. So sole proprietorship is basically an entity that is owned and governed by one person, as the name kind of suggests. You're it. It is not incorporated. You're not a company. So that's differentiated from either an LLC or a or a corporation. It is just you.
And we do have a question from the chat. They ask, are these the type of entities that we've discussed so far? Are these the only types that exist, or are there other options available to business owners?
There are other options, and the other options may be more suited to your particular situation, but we're focusing on these three because they are the more popular ones. So the other ones include like a limited liability partnership, so an LLP. There are different types of corporations, and I think the one that we're going to talk about today is a C Corp, as opposed to an S Corp, which is a little bit different, but those are the two main types of corporations.
Thanks for that insight, Jennifer. Now, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of a sole proprietorship?
The advantages is, the biggest one is that you're it, right? You have complete control, you retain all the profits, and it's really easy to establish and operate because you are the only one, so you're making all the decisions. The cons also come from the fact that you're the only one. There's relatively no liability protection there to your personal liability. And also there's no legal protection, or very limited legal protection from your personal, from you. So in this case also, it's harder to finance, and it's also harder to sell.
And we have another question from the audience. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on why this type of entity is harder to finance, and why it is also harder to sell?
Sure. So when we're talking about financing, usually it's tied up with the idea of equity. So part ownership, pieces that you can, ownerships that you can give to people that they put in equity or put in money into your company, and you can sell them parts of your company. Because of a sole proprietorship, I mean, it's just you. You are responsible. Usually, you are the one that is supplying all of the initial capital and all of the capital throughout the life of the entity. And there's no concept of equity. So you can't, there's no way for you as a sole proprietor for this entity mechanism to have people kind of give you money in exchange for pieces of your entity. And this is the same reason for that it's harder to sell. Someone who wants to buy your entity will have to buy it outright and can't own pieces of it.
Thank you.
Sure.
All righty, we're going to shift gears here. Keith, we'll come to you now. And a question for you is, what is an LLC?
Yeah, great question. So an LLC is kind of the next step up between a sole proprietorship and a C corporation, kind of a midway that blends, some of the benefits and and cons of both types of entities. But at a basic level, it is a incorporated entity, which we'll touch on a little later. And it's owned by one or more members, and it is an actual structured business entity, meaning that there does need to be some limits on the checks and balances and the powers of those that own it and manage it.
Keith, can you discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of this type of structure?
Yep. Yeah. So the big advantage I think that most people look for when they're forming a company or a business is limited liability protection. We'll go into that a little more in depth, I think, on the next slide. But at a high level, you're trying to protect your personal assets from the business of the company. It's also managed by members or a management team, meaning that it doesn't have to be just you. It can be just you. That is possible when you're forming an LLC or any type of business, but you can hire other people to be owners of the company and also help manage or run the business of the company. Another big pro is the pass-through taxation. We'll touch on this, I think, also a little bit later. But at a high level, it makes taxes easier for you and for the company. And there's only one level of tax, but I'll explain that a little bit more later. Some of the cons are liability is limited by assets, which and asset transfer, which does mean that you do need to actually, there's more admin involved. You actually have to transfer the assets to the entity so that the entity can say it owns it and make use of it. And that can be cash, that can be hard assets, it can be IT, but there does need to be an actual documentation of the transfer. And then the entity only has those assets to work with and not your personal assets. If you want to transfer personal assets, there can be, as I said, additional admin, or there could be tax consequences, or legal liability involved with it. And then there is a centralized management structure. Basically means that there are people, which could be the owners, or it could be a separate group of people that actually manage it. Could be good and a bad thing, just because they may have powers and you may not have insight into what they're doing. I think David will touch on kind of the transparency and other issues later.
We have a follow-up question for you from the audience. Could you expand just a bit more on why owners are referred to as members?
Yeah, members are is the term for the actual unit holders of the LLC. There's to differentiate them from managers, who are the ones that are running the LLC. There's a couple different levels. So there's the members, just again, instead of the owners, the managers, who are at high level, and then there's officers under them who would run the day-to-day. Those can all be the same people. It can be a different mix of people, but the terminology is there to differentiate the actual owners from the ones who are running the company.
Thanks for that insight. Now, maybe Keith, if you could talk a little bit about what limited liability protection actually means.
Yeah, and this is the thing that everybody's looking for, right? And this at a high level means that your personal assets and the company assets are separate. And that's why I touched on the fact that you do need to actually transfer the assets to the LLC. Um, Limited liability means that if the company is sued for something that it did, a product that it sold, or an event that it put on, etc., only those assets that are within the LLC or owned by the LLC are at risk. And that means if you are the owner of the LLC, your house, your car, your personal bank account, that stuff is not able to be touched, with some exceptions. And what that means is, just to touch on some of those exceptions, that there could be, if you're not using the LLC as a separate entity, basically what the court will do, or the person who is suing you will say, this isn't a real entity. We're going to pierce the corporate veil, they call it, and your personal assets will be at risk. So it's very important that you follow the proper procedures and make sure there are protocols and you're abiding by the statutes so that your personal assets do not become at risk.
And Keith, what does pass-through taxation mean? You mentioned it a few slides ago.
Yeah, so pass-through taxation basically means that the LLC itself is not taxed on its profits, and those profits are passed through directly to the owners, should say profits or losses. And this is a lot of people like this because it means that I'll touch on this when we talk about corporations in the next couple of slides, but the LLC does not have to pay taxes on its own, which can be a separate level of tax, and then also the owners pay tax on the money that's distributed to them. This means that losses are also passed through directly to the owners, and those losses can be used to offset income. Definitely talk to your tax advisors and lawyers when you're looking to start an entity. This is something that definitely should be taken into account. It also means that if there is realized profit, even if there is not any distributions from the LLC, you do have to pay taxes on it. And so what most LLCs do is they do distribute some funds, even if they're trying to grow, they'll distribute some funds to their owners to make sure that they can pay the taxes. But you do have to be wary of that, and that can cause some additional admin and tax headache.
Keith, so you mentioned it a couple of times, a corporation, right? What is a corporation? We'll start there.
Yep. So a corporation is another type of incorporated entity, different from an LLC. As Jennifer mentioned, there's different types of corporations, but what we're talking about here is a C Corp, as opposed to an S Corp or a B Corp. But if you want to talk about those later, we can. At a high level, it's owned by shareholders, and again, separate from its owners. It is a completely separate legal entity.
You referenced it, so it may be helpful for the audience to understand the differences between an S Corp, C Corp, and what are those differences?
Yeah, so an S Corp is a special type of corporation, mainly for tax purposes. It does have a lot of restrictions, like it can only have a certain number of shareholders. It can only have one class of stock. But there is pass-through taxation on an S Corp. And it's and it still gives you the limited liability protection. Some people do this because they want to flip into a C Corp later, but they want the S Corp protection, they want the pass-through status. But if you're planning on raising funds from outside investors, my experience has been that they mostly prefer a C corporation because there is a lot of structure around what the owners can and can't do, and what powers that are designated to management. And then quickly, a B corporation is really just another type of entity that is allowed to take into account some like social or environmental good, in addition to trying to maximize profits, so that their decision-making process is not solely based on maximizing profits, but they can take into account some other, socioeconomic good.
Thanks, Keith. Now let's maybe talk a little bit more about some of the advantages and disadvantages of a corporation.
Yep. So again, big advantage is that limited liability, easier to transfer ownership, and that's really what when you're a shareholder of a company, it's pretty easy, and there's a way that has been tested and proven, and that people know how to transfer shares between each other. And it's kind of all written in statute, and so it's just there's a tried and true way to transfer ownership or buy into a corporation, which is not as straightforward as it could be for an LLC, just because LLCs have a lot more flexibility in in their operating agreement and what powers and structures the owners and managers can have. The big con is double taxation. And this is something I touched on briefly previously. If the corporation makes money, makes profits, the corporation has to pay taxes on that profit. And then if it wants to distribute those profits up to its shareholders, then those shareholders also have to pay taxes on the money that's distributed to them. So that's one of the big cons. But most, like, if you're raising money, that's where the form that most people take.
Keith, so you touched on it a little bit in the last time when we were discussing some of the advantages and disadvantages, just about ownership and being a shareholder. Could you just expand a little bit more on what it means to be a shareholder?
Yeah, shareholder is terminology, it's a term of art that has been used. Sometimes it's called a stockholder, depending on which state you're in. But shareholder, stockholder are used interchangeably a lot of times. And it's really just any person or entity that owns one share of the company. The stockholders are the owners of the company. And again, I can go back into those three steps, those three levels of control. The shareholders are kind of the main level, or the highest level. And the shareholders elect the board, who kind of run like at a high level of the company, and then the officers are elected by the board, and the officers run the day-to-day operation. And so the shareholders are who the board and the officers serve at the behest of.
And so what does it mean to be incorporated?
Yeah, it really just means you're registered with the state, and so that it becomes a separate legal entity. And the process that's involved there is pretty simple from a state level. It really means that you're just filing for a C corporation, what's really called the Articles of Incorporation or the Certificate of Incorporation. Again, just depends on which state you are, which term they like to use. But you're filing that with the state to make sure that they know that you have formed a separate entity. They return something to you, say that, we've acknowledged that you are a separate entity, and then you continue to pay franchise taxes or filing fees, or make annual reports with that state that you're incorporated in, so that they, one, have some information on you, two, can collect their money, obviously, and three, make sure that you are kind of an ongoing business and not just like kind of a shell entity that's sitting out there.
So evidently there's a number of jurisdictions where an entrepreneur or business owner can incorporate. Does it matter where a company is incorporated?
So matter. There's places that people like to be incorporated. The number one, I guess, state that that companies like to be, C corps like to be incorporated is probably Delaware. And there are many reasons for that. I think we're going to get into that a little bit later, but Delaware is a very popular place, and New York. You can be incorporated in the same state that you're going to be operating your business, but you don't have to.
And so what is a principal place of business for an entity?
So this is where you're actually operating your business from. So the state and where you're actually operating the business from. So this can be separate from the state where you incorporate the business. So very popular is to incorporate as a Delaware corporation, but operate in your home state, wherever that is more convenient for you. So for an example, my own company, we're a Delaware C Corp, and but our principal place of business is California because that's where I live, and that's where most of our employees live.
Thanks, Jennifer. And you mentioned it a couple times now, Delaware, right? Do you
Right.
have to incorporate in Delaware? And why is it so often that we hear that companies do incorporate in that state?
You don't have to incorporate in Delaware, but many entities do. And there's several reasons for this, and top of which is that Delaware offers very business-friendly corporate laws, and also there are tax benefits, and they're very experienced courts and very well-established ways in which Delaware has interpret the laws. And so, and when we're talking about friendly corporate laws, this rolls all the way down from their standard articles of corporations to your company bylaws. So the way that you have agreed to run your business and how you're going to set up the basic structure and how your business is going to operate. So this is why Delaware is so popular as a choice of a corporation.
Thanks, Jennifer. Keith, we're going to come back to you now and talk a little bit about funding your corporation. Could you explain to us what is capitalization?
Yeah, capitalization is basically the ownership of the corporation. You know, as we talked about who the shareholders or the stockholders are, that is what the capitalization of the company is. Typically at formation, and it's something I do a lot with my clients, is we issue the initial shares to the founders, and they'll, you know, it's a couple of founders that may break it up 50-50 or 75-25. And then as the company grows and wants to, you know, raise funding to, you know, get on a new product or scale, they'll take on additional shareholders by accepting money at a, you know, at a certain valuation and issuing shares to those new investors. And so at the beginning, you know, the founders will own 100%, but as they issue new shares to new investors, they get diluted down. So they own a smaller piece of the pie, but the thought is that they're, you know, taking this money so that they can grow into a much bigger pie, and then everybody's happy.
Thanks, Keith. All right, so I've decided to start a corporation or to form a corporation, and I've chosen Delaware and want to raise some capital. So it's time to get down to business. What are some things that I need to think about as I'm running my corporation? David, we haven't heard from you yet. It'd be great to hear your insight.
Thanks so much, Quinn. You know, so a lot of the background that Keith and Jen have laid out here really goes into some of the core decision making on setting foundations for kind of getting up and running, getting into the business ideas to take the form of a legal entity. And you've already thought through a lot of the kind of key points on liability, responsibility, how you want to be scaling up your organization, and how you want to capitalize to get it financed. And Quinn, exactly right. One of the key features of the living, breathing organization that has been set up is governance. And if you are a C Corp, or if you're really any corporation, or frankly any entity, you have to be thinking about these different pillars of corporate governance. Certainly, if you're a sole proprietorship, you're running the show alone, you're not a corporation, you don't have the same level of stakeholder concern. That's one thing that might actually, you know, help you decide you don't want to move on from sole proprietorship just yet as you're scaling your idea. The moment you start to kind of open up the the complexity of an organization, maybe as you get larger and your business is taking off and there are going to be more and more opportunities for getting funding, you have to always be cognizant of the fact that, with rewards of funding and more capital come more responsibility overall. So we wanted to walk through corporate governance. Generally speaking, you can think of corporate governance as a framework of policies and guidelines that an entity uses to inform its decision-making, conduct, and practices. Corporate governance isn't any one thing, but it's a whole slew of things, and we've described them as 4 pillars. I will say that different states will have different requirements from a corporate governance perspective. Public companies that are listed on a U.S. exchange, like the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, have some prescriptive, very specific corporate governance rules, responsibilities around accounting, for example, how they're running their financial statements, that kind of information. But at its core, any corporation that is set up needs to be concerned about good housekeeping, because again, when you have more stakeholders, you have more risk of litigation disputes, and you need to be careful to protect yourself, the assets of the organization, your own assets, etc. So we want to walk through these 4 pillars that help, I think, summarize key corporate governance considerations, and we'll kick it off with accountability.
Yeah, so let's start off accountability, as you mentioned. Can you just tell me a little bit more about accountability, and then we'll continue on with the remaining 3 pillars?
Perfect. Thanks, Quinn. So, just to sum up here, as we say, assuming responsibility for the consequences of an entity's actions, in many cases, organizations themselves are going to have to be accountable to their various stakeholders. Keith was walking us through a little bit, and Jen also talked us through corporate form. When you have directors and officers, you have a board, you have different managers who are responsible for how assets of a company are used to generate capital, generally to ensure that they're complying with a whole slew of different regulations. They have to be licensed in many cases. You have to always be concerned about what an entity is going to potentially be responsible for. So one of the kind of core principles behind accountability is being cognizant of the fact that a failure to comply is going to be a drag on the business activities of the entity. And so one of the ways that you can get in front of that is by having good policies from day one, from a corporate governance perspective, that ensure that certain acts aren't taken, right? And that there is already a framework in place to protect all of the various stakeholders for the entity from future liability for any kind of non-compliance, either with law or potentially just in a one-on-one contractual context. The larger organizations get, the more they're usually contracting with different stakeholders, with suppliers, with customers, et cetera. And core principle is ensuring that there's consistency in the way that the entity is going to be engaging in these types of new commitments, so that they can be accountable, and that there won't be any kind of problem down the line. There are many instances where I've worked with companies that have non-compliance with their core policies, because some organizations can put a great corporate governance structure in place, but they won't necessarily have the right approach to compliance. So a core part of accountability is ensuring compliance, making sure that there is typically an internal legal counsel. If there isn't enough, resource to actually hire an in-house lawyer or an in-house compliance specialist, ensuring that, with some regularity, there might be an outside consultant from a legal or compliance perspective that can go through books and can look at the operations of the entity. So accountability, a core principle.
And how about transparency? What can you tell us about that?
Great. Transparency is a bit tricky, because it can seem like good corporate citizenship and good housekeeping and good corporate governance requires fulsome openness and honesty in different transactions. And certainly, honesty is a core feature of corporate governance. The opposite typically being fraud. and fraud, from a criminal perspective, only attracts problems. So certainly transparency is one of our pillars to try to protect an entity and its various stakeholders from potential liability and loss. The only caveat I always make here when I discuss with clients, okay, great, I want to share my information. I'm going to, have an open access approach. I'll put all of our documents on online on our website. Obviously, there are going to be instances where certain information is going to be subject to confidentiality. There are going to be, instances where there will be legal restrictions on what an entity can and can't put out in the public domain. So it's important to remain cognizant of confidentiality of any counterparty, frankly, certainly on a contractual basis, but also with personal data more and more. Certainly California is leading the charge on data privacy, data protection. So that's an important component. And so, as Jen was saying, there are instances where you may have a Delaware corporation like her own that's operating in California. I mean, it means that you could have both Delaware and California laws to abide by. If there are no operations in a particular context, but you have, you touch a jurisdiction, you may sell some products in Kansas. You just need to be cognizant of whatever jurisdiction you touch, to whatever kind of degree. You just want to make sure you're analyzing how you might be subject to those various laws. So transparency is a core pillar, but at the same time, you need to be careful with confidentiality concerns. And the other, instance we use, there are always going to be trade secrets that come up. You need to be able to protect the intellectual property of your organization. And so there certainly are carve-outs from the transparency expectations so that you're not actually forced to be giving up some trade secret, the Coca-Cola formula or something else that's really essential to the way that you operate your business. So good advice around this core principle is an important one, and it's quite nuanced.
Thanks, David. Let's touch on fairness.
Excellent. So fairness, we've described here as protecting rights and ensuring even-handed treatment of those with interest in the company. This is, it should go without saying, an entity and its various stakeholders will be exposed to liability if they're discriminatory in any way. And for whatever reason, they've decided to treat, like people differently for whatever reason, on whatever basis. There are a lot of different instances where, good faith and fair dealing is a standard that as you scale a business, you're going to be subject to more and more. There's going to be more and more scrutiny, more and more contacts with different people. So certainly as a bedrock kind of pillar of good corporate governance, it's important to keep in mind that fairness is not just expected. In many cases, it's required, and it's legally protected. So it's a great way of just kind of running the business organization and how employees are treated as well as other stakeholders. Certainly, there are instances where there will be disproportionate influence, so that's okay and that's normal. I talk all the time with clients about minority rights of shareholders. If they just have a stake, or you have, a family member that wants to invest in your company, and they come in and they're going to think, maybe they won't even be thinking about what kind of corporate governance protections they may have. It's fine under corporate law for different, stakeholders to have different treatment based on their proportion of voting, for example, and they may be trumped and they by a particular majority decision that founders take on, et cetera. And you can go into more detail and probably call Keith to chat a little bit about how some protections can be built into corporate documents. But those are just a couple different nuances I wanted to make sure you look at that would, otherwise, qualify a statement that all companies that are running a healthy, strong corporate governance system are very focused on fairness, because that's always the way to start, and then think about how your particular organization and stakeholders should shape the policies to meet the realities of the company.
Thanks for illustrating some of those nuances to the fairness pillar. And last but not least, I think it'd be helpful to talk about responsibility.
Great. Responsibility more than ever before is a concern, I'd say, that the investment community has really driven in creative ways. I don't know how many people are involved in instances where ESG, that acronym has come up with environmental, social, and governance standards. When we think about corporate governance and the G in ESG, we think about entities that are trying to become more cognizant of their impact on society, and that again takes many forms. We've talked a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which many people ascribe to the S in ESG, the social side of doing right for our communities, our people internally, but also our people and our various stakeholders externally. Clearly, the environment and concerns around climate change are kind of on many people's radars. And to take on a strong corporate governance system and framework this day and age, there's an expectation from a lot of investors in the general investment community to be thinking about being accountable and responsible to our communities. The word sustainability is coming up all the time now with a lot of my clients who are actually getting some financing benefits by saying, I'd like to go raise some capital. I want to expand my activities, my operations. I want to hire more people. I want to buy more equipment. I want to, include a second wing on our building or our production facility. And a question that comes up quite often now for commercial banks, as well as just individual investors or institutional investors, is what are you thinking about from a sustainability perspective? Is what you're doing environmentally responsible? So, this pillar of corporate governance is really quite important to take on, I think, particularly this day and age. And it's stimulating a lot of debate around the mission for a lot of organizations, that have gone on that are going to be profit seeking. In many cases, investors, particularly for public companies, are going to look to a profit maximization within the investment thesis. People do want to do good while doing well and vice versa. But managers these days and corporate boards these days are regularly asked in investor relations meetings, what are you doing to have more sustainable business? How are you embedding accountability and responsibility and sustainability into the DNA of your organization? So something to take on, early on in your journey of growing your business.
Thanks, David. And it looks like we have a follow-up question from the chat or from the audience. So how do these pillars, right, accountability, transparency, fairness, and responsibility, how do these pillars translate to real life? You spoke a little bit about some hypothetical scenarios, but do you have any real-world examples of a corporation that needed to show adherence to one or more of these pillars?
Sure. I like to actually talk about some of my clients who have worked for years and years in the energy business, where from a general background perspective, you want to be able to tell different stakeholders, including investors, that you're just going to be churning out more and more energy, and that energy is going to hopefully be done or generated in a more and more efficient way to generate as much profit as possible. What's complicated there this day and age, though, is energy at any cost growth and is any kind of investment going to be deemed kind of responsible? Is it going to be meeting the needs of communities in which you operate? And most companies that I work with now have an energy transition strategy, looking for more renewable sources, or then they themselves creating opportunities for investors and other stakeholders to come in. So it's a good example of seeing how corporate governance needs to reflect and sort of evolve with the times. It's not okay anymore simply to say that a company is going to be 100% coal producing without at least being transparent still in how that coal production is affecting local communities. That said, energy transition is a transition. It's not we're going from zero fossil fuels to or all fossil fuels to zero fossil fuels. So I work with clients who technically do have quote unquote dirty businesses that work with fossil fuel sources of energy, and they have to rely more on their pillar of transparency to talk to markets and say, this is what we're doing. We recognize that climate change is the thing and our communities are nervous about them, but we also recognize that we have 50,000 people that we employ, and we want to be fair to our people. We're not just going to all of a sudden take a trend and cut off business. So the components of fairness and transparency in many cases can be used to explain how an energy transition can be deployed. Maybe that's not as relevant to this audience directly who aren't, in the energy sector, but you think you can make a lot of parallels with any aspect of business that's in the process of evolving. We all have to be stewards of limited and scarce resources, and just communicate with our shareholders, treat everybody fairly, and think about ways to go, on a path of modernization using, new technologies in a way that will hopefully allow for companies to be more responsible in stewarding their resources. So I think those are a couple real world examples, but I can give you a million more.
Well, we only have 14 minutes left, but thank you for those great examples and that illustration. So we've reached the point in our conversation where we're going to leave the floor open to some more questions. If there aren't any, I'll turn it back over to my co-moderator Tasha. But thank you to the audience for the engagement so far. These have been great questions, and it's been great to hear a little bit more from our panelists. Okay, Tasha, maybe if you want to kind of round us out. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions, but there's still time, folks. So if there's anything, please feel free to ask. Oh, it looks like we do actually have a question. So the question is for each of the panelists, what is the most important thing that people should know? I think for our panelists, maybe the best way to kind of address that is, you each kind of had a topic that you talked about, maybe talk about some of the best things that they should know within the context of what you each discussed.
So I can go first. I think the biggest kind of like take-home message is if you have an idea and you really, you feel like you're ready to start your own company or your own entity, it's really think about where you want to end up or where you want your entity, what kind of business are you going to be doing? And then go and get some advice from experts who can help you with your incorporation or setting up your entity. Because basically, you will save yourself so much headache and heartache if you do it right from the beginning. And really, that is the time to get a legal professional to come in and help you and to answer all of your questions if this is your first time doing starting your own company. For a lot of your clients or even yourselves, this may be the first time you're ever going to start your own business. So get the help of a professional who can answer your questions and get you started off on the right foot or the correct foot.
Yeah, and I just want to build on that. I was going to say something I run into a lot with my clients is, they don't really understand what taking in investors and taking in money means. I see most people form LLCs, or I advise people to form LLCs when they want to form what I refer to as a lifestyle business. Something that's going to, maybe make some money, and you can like do it day in, day out, and you'll be happy doing that. But you're not looking to like take in other outside investors and scale at a huge level. Obviously, fine to take in small amount of investors, friends, family. That's pretty normal. But once you decide to take in like institutional or VC investment, you do have responsibility to those people, right? And even if it's just a third party you don't know, like you have a responsibility to make sure that you're abiding by those pillars that David talked about. You can't just decide, I don't really want to do this anymore. I'm going to shut this company down. Obviously, that is something that happens, but you need to be more thoughtful about how you're shutting it down. Are you returning capital? Is this what's best for the stockholders? And so deciding to take in money and deciding to scale is definitely a decision you should not take lightly, and talk to your advisors about doing it before you decide to go down that route.
Great. And I mean, those are very wise words, and experienced words. I mean, I think maybe the only thing that I would add here, especially from a corporate governance perspective, is to recognize that entities should be fit for purpose. But you want to start, as Jennifer was saying, really on the right foot, on the correct foot. You want to make sure that you're going to have kind of a lot of the fundamentals in place to allow you to scale quickly. Sometimes, you'll have a windfall. There will be an opportunity for an investor to come in, or there's a new, potential partnership that you want to enter into, and you could scale fairly quickly. But if you haven't been documenting the journey of the organization effectively and kind of practicing good hygiene, as we say, with documentation, trying to keep as many alternatives on the table, you may be cut off from getting some great funding. Being disciplined about the organizational side of the business early on could really make you a more attractive, again, business partner or potential recipient of some capital in fundraising. And you'd be surprised. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that you actually, you want to kind of talk about a business idea. You're so excited about what you have to offer. But if you haven't invested some time and as Jen said, probably some resources with some legal advice to kind of set up appropriately, you just might not be taken as seriously as you deserve to be. And that's not right. So some of it is the organizational bit, some of it's kind of hitting the ground running, but with a thoughtful approach to some of the structures that we've been discussing here. And it is okay if you have to go back and change. It's not the end of the world, but it could be twice as expensive, or it could take twice as long. So being mindful of these different steps as you keep scaling is important, and look for, advice. There's a lot of free advice out there, certainly online. There's a lot of Google searches that will yield a lot of answers. So I wouldn't sort of get nervous that everything is going to cost so much. But there's a lot that comes from communicating with others who have gone through similar paths and journeys, and you should really be a beneficiary of that. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. You should really be focused on your passion, on what sorts of products and services that you're involved in. And there's no need to kind of be the first of much here. In fact, I think a lot of the things that Jen and Keith and I are trying to express is you just want to make sure you understand a lot of these fundamentals, but there's no need to kind of, again, reinvent the wheel in many cases. So, relying a little bit on precedent, for better or for worse. That's what lawyers do every day is, we're going to let you know what you're saying is the first time I've ever heard of that. And that's not always a good sign. So it's good to think about ways where there's space for innovation and ways where it's totally fine just to, do what the tried and true path will look like. So it's yeah, just put it at that.
Thank you to the panelists for the insight. We have another question. How do I know who to go to help me form a business? They followed up by saying that sometimes it is hard to tell when you just Google it. I think maybe you can be overwhelmed with the amount of resources that come back from a pretty generic search inquiry. So if anyone would like to take that one.
Well, I'm going to volunteer Keith. I think you should go to Keith, and he will help you set up your business.
I definitely will. Happy to help. You can always come to me. Even if I am not the right person, I can definitely help you find the right person. But come to a lawyer. We're definitely happy to touch on, LegalZoom or Stripe Atlas and those types of things. We've definitely worked with companies who've formed with them before, and we can help clean things up and make sure, as they was talking about, you guys have that good corporate hygiene. That's a lot of what we do, and so that you're ready to raise, you have everything ready to go, and there's no issues or concerns. So definitely come to me or a lawyer.
And I just think that go to if you can find someone who has done it, who has started their own business, that's kind of like what you want to do. talk to them. There's no better kind of resource than someone who's been through it. And from my experience, founders are super excited to share knowledge, just in general. And my experience has been that, other CEOs and founders have just been so kind and generous with all the advice that I've asked them for. And we're always willing to kind of pass it on to the next generation or the next person who has a great idea and wants to start their own business. So
Thank you, Keith and Jennifer. Any more questions before I turn it back over to Tasha? Okay. Well,
I feel like me showing my face will be a cue for somebody else to throw another question in there.
yeah, I was hoping
We'll
so.
see.
Yeah.
All right, it looks like there are no more questions, though. I want to thank you all for providing a wealth of information tonight. I know I took some notes. I hope everyone in the audience did. But lucky for us, this was all recorded as well. And so we will share this on our YouTube page at a later date. We'll send an email out to everyone when that is up. We also hope that you will subscribe to our newsletter so that you can be informed of future events, including the next sessions in this webinar series. So thank you to all of our wonderful speakers and our moderator, and to everyone for participating tonight. Good evening and